Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Nick Godfrey, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Nick, on today's episode, we have a very special guest, the key leader from Google Cloud, with whom we have the pleasure of working, Francis deSouza, Chief Operating Officer of Google Cloud.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one, David. Francis brings a unique lens to our discussion, and having previously served as CEO of Illumina, a global leader in DNA sequencing, but also as president of cybersecurity giant Symantec. And he has extensive board experience, including with Disney, which further enriches his perspective on navigating these complex challenges at the boardroom.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. So let's get right to it. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Francis deSouza, Chief Operating Officer at Google Cloud. Francis, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thank you for having me on.
Let's get right to it. Francis, Nick and I mentioned in the opening a few of your roles prior to Google Cloud, including being a board member and a former CEO. And in those roles, you've obviously held the ultimate responsibility for an organization's overall business strategy, which includes protecting critical and sensitive data. So reflecting back, can you share with our listeners your thoughts on how boards should integrate cyber into their overall business strategy? What have you seen that works well, and probably equally important, what doesn't work so well?
Yeah, sure. And as I reflect back over the last maybe even couple of decades, cybersecurity has grown in importance as a board level issue. And that's really been driven by a number of big trends that have been playing out in the marketplace. One is, we've continued to see the digital transformation of industries and of organizations. And what that has meant is that more and more of a company's critical assets is actually digital data. And so we've continued to see the amount of valuable data that a company has, digital data that a company has, continue to grow. And so that provides a bigger and bigger surface area for the bad guys to attack. At the same time, we have seen an intensification of the threat landscape. And so, what used to be a landscape dominated by initially hackers has now dramatically expanded, where we're seeing, and we have seen over the last decade plus, the emergence of organized gangs and organized groups that are specifically formed and are very sophisticated to extract value from organizations by holding their data ransom. And so we've seen the increasing sophistication of the attack groups, and then we've seen the emergence of military and paramilitary organizations that are also targeting organizations. So we've seen, more and more of a company's critical assets be in the form of digital data. We've seen an intensification of the threat landscape, and we've seen an increasing sophistication as a result of the methods that are being used to attack organizations. Those forces have combined to create a very real risk that needs to be monitored by the board. And so boards have really sort of absorbed the idea that they, as part of their duties, need to understand the security posture of an organization, make sure that the company is doing the right things to address this intensifying threat landscape, and then also is prepared when a breach happens, that, they've done the work to understand, what they would do, how they would act, and so on. And so, we're seeing that become an increasing part of a board's agenda. We've also seen it move from being something that was delegated just to an audit and risk committee to something that's now become important to every board member.
Yeah, I think that's right, Francis. And all of this is obviously driving ever increased investment in cybersecurity. Curious if you sat on the side of the table of a pure play security company like Symantec, and now in your current role you're sitting at the kind of the innovation, the edge of innovation with Google Cloud. As we think about that strategic investment that boards are making in cybersecurity, where do you see the best opportunities for boards to be able to sort of converge the security investments with core business, value creation, as opposed to just distinct sort of cost line item,
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One, that boards, sort of need to develop a framework by which they sort of think about the investments they're making in their cybersecurity infrastructure. And so, various things feed into sort of that. One is, simply just benchmarking, is an organization spending enough on their cybersecurity infrastructure, too much, too little? And there's good data out there, that breaks down, for example, a percentage of an IT budget that a company spends on cybersecurity or percentage of revenue. And there it's important to look at the spend by industry, because certain industries have a lot more valuable digital assets. Certain industries are more targeted. And so one is just get sort of good outside-in data to see where your company is in terms of the spend in cybersecurity. But spend alone isn't enough. You need to start to think about, okay, well, how effective is that spend? And so there, it's important to have a framework, whether it's the NIST, framework or any other framework out there that helps contextualize the security posture of a company. And again, sort of benchmarks it against other companies in that industry and sort of assesses the maturity of where a company is today, but then also helps prioritize where the most urgent gaps that need to be addressed are. And so that helps you sort of lay out a multi-year roadmap of how you should prioritize your cybersecurity investments. And so that's important too. It's really important, too, for an organization and a board especially to have a sense for, the risks associated with the breach across different parts of their enterprise, and some kind of handle on the costs associated with the different types of breaches. And that could be, hard costs in terms of what it would cost to remediate. That could be reputational damage associated with a breach. And again, that too will help assess the ROI of the investments that an organization is making in cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's great. I think with that sort of approach over a number of months and years, you can start getting to a place where you have a good understanding of your capability versus your threats and your risks. But of course, one of the facts of life is mergers and acquisitions. And, in many industries, they are quite a significant growth driver and fairly prominent in terms of board strategies. But obviously, that carefully curated cyber profile that's been created is now being adjusted because of the potential from acquiring or merging with another firm. So from the board's perspective, how have you seen that sort of work through? What are the most critical cybersecurity considerations and the due diligence that you'd need to go through when evaluating an M&A opportunity, particularly from the cyber perspective?
That's absolutely right, Nick. I mean, it's true that an organization can have the exact security posture at once, but given how important, as you said, M&A is becoming to company strategies, that immediately gets disrupted as you bring in another organization. And so there are several considerations for a board. One is that assessing the target company's security posture is a critical component of the due diligence that's being done before the company is brought into the fold. In rare cases, that could be binary but just in terms of saying that the target may be bringing too much risk into the fold, but that's rare. More commonly, what the due diligence does is it helps a company create the roadmap associated with bringing the target company into the compliance with, the acquirer's, security and compliance posture. And, that roadmap includes sort of non-negotiables that need to happen on day one. That could be, for example, as simple as issuing new laptops to all the employees of the target company that are compliant with the acquiring company's security posture. It also needs to have a point of view on, network segregation and what you want to do on day one. How do you want to integrate the acquired company's network into the acquiring company's network? And identities, how does the identity sort of evolve, the individual's identities evolve? And then also the remediation roadmap. Very often, a large company is buying a smaller company that may not have paid the same amount of attention to, remediating patches that occur. It's also important that as part of the due diligence process, a company uses a third party, to assess the security of the acquired company. So that's, things like pen testing and so on, to just assess the controls even that exist in the acquired company. And so, getting information from the target company is important, but it is just as important to make sure that you have third-party assessments being done to inform, the roadmap post-acquisition.
Yeah, and it's about going into it being fully informed because, as you say, a large company acquiring a small company, that small company probably will have less mature cyber approaches for good reason, right? It's not as important in their kind of where they're at. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Francis, you mentioned ROI, and we host a series of board of director roundtables, and that theme of ROI and value creation always comes up. And I think the boards generally understand that cyber now is a business enabler. But what questions do you think the board should have kind of top of mind when they're discussing investments with their teams so that, kind of to your point, it's actually getting at the real business value kind of piece of it rather than being just a compliance exercise for security?
Yeah, there are a few areas where a board needs to really sort of dig deep on. One is, for example, really understanding the surface area that needs to be protected. A board should be asking, what are our most important digital assets? If you are a company that creates content, like a media company, for example, then, the movie code is your important asset, right? Or it could be, formulas for drug development, for example. But really understanding what are the most important digital assets. Is it the source code that your company has? Where are they and how well they are protected? It's also important to understand what your most important physical assets are that have a software component that could be compromised. This could be, factories that you have. This could be other physical infrastructure that could be compromised. So understanding, sort of not just what your most important digital assets are, but what are your most important physical assets that could be compromised and what's sort of the security posture associated with those. It's also important to understand, then again, associated with them, what's the level of maturity of the protection around, those assets. It's important to understand then also what's the cost of a breach or the different types of breaches associated with those assets. How much is a company spending relative to benchmarks in their industry in protecting those assets? It's important to also make sure that you have third-party assessments of your, sort of security posture, and then run simulations to make sure you'd understand, and tabletop exercises to make sure you understand what, sort of a board would do and what a leadership team would do to react quickly in the event that there is a breach.
Yeah, I like that. It's very much kind of a resiliency exercising and understanding how those assets support the processes and critical business services that a company is delivering.
Absolutely. And to, sort of pick a military metaphor, the board needs to understand both what would happen left of bang, what needs to happen left of bang, so before an incident happens, and then, post bang, what happens immediately after, both of which are really important.
Okay, so we've been chatting for about 15 minutes, Francis, and we've managed to not yet talk about AI, so let's get that corrected. Across the globe, we're hearing, and I'm sure you are as well, very diverse views on AI. Is it pure hype? Is it the ultimate enabler? Is it a profound threat? Is it a huge advantage with huge upside and potential from a security perspective? And the board, obviously, as with all new technologies and business changes, has to balance the enabling of innovation and trying out these new things with not necessarily or unnecessarily increasing the risk profile. So as you're working with boards and you're seeing sort of the forefront of this use of AI, how are you seeing boards, foster that secure innovation rather than just innovation as an approach?
Yeah, while there are debates across many, many aspects of AI, one area there shouldn't be a debate on is the fact that AI will change a company's cybersecurity posture. And that's going to happen in a number of ways. One, it increases the surface area that needs to be protected by bringing in AI models into companies. Those models need to be protected, both from sort of vulnerabilities, but also things like prompt injections, for example. And so it creates a new surface area that needs to be protected. You're also seeing, for example, the fact that when companies bring agents into their environment, agents have access to a lot more data in their company than people typically did. What that means is that bringing agents into your company requires you to harden the data assets in your company. Because, for example, you may have had a whole set of SharePoint servers in your company that weren't particularly hardened, or the access controls weren't, maintained as well as they should have, that weren't really being accessed by people, and so it didn't represent a very large security risk. But as you enable agents in your environment, those SharePoint servers could now be accessed. And so it becomes important that you harden the data infrastructure that you have already in your company that you may not have paid attention to before. Yeah. AI also means, though, that organizations now have access to more sophisticated forms of defense, cybersecurity defense, and will also be facing more sophisticated forms of attack as the bad actors are enabled by AI. And so AI will change, how boards think about cybersecurity by increasing the surface area that they will need to protect, by providing new tools by which an organization can defend itself more quickly and more effectively than before, but also by, increasing the intensity of the threat landscape that they're facing.
So, Francis, I want to pivot a bit and talk a little bit more about the human aspect. I think an overarching theme for our own Board Insights program has been that effective boards don't just monitor cyber, but they actually are engaged in it. And so in that spirit, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on how a board can effectively champion and oversee the development of a strong cyber-aware culture across the entire enterprise, right? Whether that's at the executive suite level, all the way down to the kind of front lines.
The board can start by, and does start by, setting the tone at the top. By putting cybersecurity on the agenda regularly, and again, not just at audit and risk committee meetings, but at the board level, at least once a year. The board needs to, review a company's security posture as attested to both by the internal teams as well as by external third parties, as well as review the plan of action associated with a breach. So put it on the agenda, sort of make sure that the teams present, where they are and how they would act. In addition, I'd say a new question that boards should be asking is around the AI preparedness, of the organization from a cybersecurity posture. How is the AI infrastructure being developed, being hardened? How are you preventing model drift? How are you ensuring that the data sources that agents access, are hardened appropriately? How are you identifying agents in your enterprise and maintaining the right access controls associated with those agents? In addition, one of the things that boards need to think about is that as we look to the future, the individuals in an organization that will be successful will be what we're calling bilingual, meaning that they will be experts in their domain, whether it's, sales or marketing or finance, as well as very knowledgeable in AI and how it could impact their domain. And that holds true in spades for cybersecurity. It's increasingly important that boards feel confident that the company's cybersecurity teams are bilingual, that they are fluent not just in cybersecurity, but in the language of AI, in terms of both the threats it represents as well as the opportunities it creates to strengthen defenses.
Yeah, I really like that bilingual. I might have to borrow that.
Yeah.
It's all yours.
But as you mentioned, as we sort of look a little bit to the future, if we were to look 3 to 5 years down the road, is there a single, maybe it's AI, but is there a single sort of critical cybersecurity challenge that you think boards will be addressing then? And what do you think boards should do now in order to be ready for that in 3 to 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think it will be AI and agentic AI. I think those will be, important parts of a board cybersecurity conversation going forward. And, just as we talked about, requiring your teams in the organization to be bilingual, I think one of the things board members should be doing is making sure that they are bilingual too, that a board can understand and is comfortable with, what AI would mean for the business of the company, but also for the security posture of a company.
Yeah.
So, Francis, last question while we still have you. And we ask this of everyone that comes onto the podcast. What's one key action that our boardroom listeners can take away from today's discussion?
I'd say the single action is to get familiar with what AI could do. Get curious and learn more about what AI could do from a cybersecurity perspective. I think that's probably the single action that I'd encourage everybody that sits on a board, to do.
That's great. Continuous education. I love it. So, Francis, thank you very much for your time today and for joining us in the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
My pleasure.